Hello, and welcome to another spoiler episode for Umineko. This next bit is going to cover part 2 of my videos. Before we even get into the next video though, I actually forgot something. I didn't think of it as maybe more accurate. The opening I watched, they're singing in Japanese. I didn't think to look up a translation, but I accidentally stumbled onto a video that does have subtitles for most of the lyrics. This video will be playing as I talk here, but you will see subtitles pop up, so I'm gonna look through those because there may be relevant things in there. Maybe not groundbreaking, but useful stuff to pay attention to. Perhaps. You'll notice this is also like the original opening because it's got all the old backgrounds. Something golden curse and words left behind. Obviously referring to the mountain of gold. The fact that it's a curse is funny because it never seems to enable the Ashuramias to be happier people. It only enables them to be worse people. For the most part, pretty much. Words left behind. I am just, again, thinking about Kinzo utterly refusing to write a will and inform the rest of his family about his secret grandchild. So, hidden smiles are blurred crimson is funny to me. I would have picked most of the Ashuramiya parents as the opposite. Like, they're putting on smiles and being vaguely polite. But there's a kind of underlying hostility to everything because they're trying to vie for position. Are we talking an even deeper hidden smile under all of that? And then blurred crimson, I'm just reading, is being murdered. In particular, what do you seek with eyes closed is surely being said to Battler. Because listen, let me tell you, Battler, you're not going to figure out anything that's going on if you're going to refuse to listen, learn, or pay any attention to what is being communicated to you. Which he spends half the game doing, pretty much. Even if you try gather those shattered pieces, you won't reach them if you draw back the fingers they touch. I'm reading that as he's not going to be able to put together the mystery if he's going to try and do it dispassionately, if he's going to try and disconnect it from the people involved. I mean, obviously Beatrice is one of those people, but it's kind of about the general way in which the why is way more important than the how. People's personal motivations will drive them to act, and if you ignore their personal motivations, you'll never truly understand them or what they're doing. Battler kind of has the spin the chessboard thinking as a tool, but he's not using it to empathize. He's just using it to try and he's just trying to use it to game a situation. But if he actually acknowledges the humanity and viewpoint of the person at the other side of the chessboard, he would do better to see what they're trying to say to him or like understand things from their position. Without love, you can't tell the twisted lies from the truth. Of course, without love being a very important pair of words. Like, without love, it can't be seen. Again, about the personal motivation, but much more directly to you will never understand. And like, this is obviously, again, about Beatrice. You won't understand if you're not going to view this with love, if you are going to view this antagonistically and try to put distance between you, refusing to engage on that other person's terms. That was just a short little detour. But interesting to look at that stuff. At some point I'll also look at, there's the PS3 game apparently has a massive, the PS3 game has an opening that's actually a huge spoiler because it has basically the entire game in it. Not like laying it out clearly obviously, but it has stuff from like episode 8 in there. It's very funny. So one thing we get more into in this section is the expectations of the gender roles being imposed upon these characters. We're getting a little bit of it with Maria, but also Jessica is actually a good example of it. One thing I didn't know before, but just noticed it when kind of going through the section. Jessica's referred to as having a crazy way of speaking, and looking that up, that's actually about gendered language and kind of what politely the words that a girl would use in Japanese if they were speaking correctly, as in politely, and what the words a boy would use. And Jessica speaks the way a boy does, and that is her crazy way of speaking, which is interesting to me because frequently both Jessica and Maria will be scolded for the things they say and behaving inappropriately and the ways in which they deviate. They're both constantly being molded into behaving properly, and specifically by their mothers too. Maria obviously doesn't have a father in the picture, but Kraus never really engages with raising Jessica in that way. He's much more concerned with business matters, which is kind of his MO in general, but it is striking how much specifically Rosa and Natsuhi are constantly just correcting their daughters on wording and impropriety. Meanwhile, Battler is being an objectively gross manhandling man, because he is 18, he's not a boy, and suffers no real consequences for it. His father is a womanizer, so it's somewhat to be expected, but also Kyrie doesn't care. There's an extent to which that's because she doesn't see Battler really as her son. But even so, they just sort of let him do what he wants. Obviously, George is just George. George fulfills his role exactly, so there's no room for him to be scolded either way. But it is very gendered how much the corrections are being applied to their behaviors. And some of this as well goes into the natural notion of what gender roles are. This is another kind of magical thinking, where people just believe that gender roles are a natural expression of biology and not an imposed societal idea. Because if you notice the bit with Jessica and Battler, you could take it a little bit either way, but the implication to me is that Jessica is just better and could beat Battler in a fight, but they're kind of playing it as if Battler's winning, and it's because he's become a man now and Jessica's becoming a woman, so obviously that's de-emphasizing her boyish traits and making her into a woman instead of the kind of person who could beat a man in a fight. We'll see some fighting from Jessica later. She is much better trained than Battler. Battler's a crybaby who I don't think ever gets in a fight. Unlike Jessica. Yeah, it is extremely on the nose that even directly Battler says, "Oh, your muscles must have gone to your chest instead, ha ha ha," and then joking to try and brush off the deviation from the standard gender roles that they should both be abiding to. This is a minor note, but I kind of want to track it because it will be relevant in later parts. Based on my recollection of future events, Jessica invited Kanon to come with her to pick people up, but he declined and got Kumasawa-san to cover for him. That's why Ava's like, "Oh, it's unusual for Kumasawa-san to come pick us up," and then makes some joke about it. They just joke around a bit, blah blah blah. That is presumably because Kanon is extremely anxious about meeting Battler again. It behooves me at this point to make explicit how I read the ending of the game, because the game is not very direct about dealing with revealing the identity of Beatrice and her connection to Shannon and Kanon. I think I am going to be clear about how I will describe them going forward. They're individual people, they're distinct people who share a singular body. I will treat them with that level of respect. They're obviously individual people who share a body and therefore share things like knowledge and memories that will impact upon other things. And so Kanon remembers Battler's broken promise to Shannon. That makes it extremely difficult to come and see him now. But at the same time I think wants to see him, to know who he is, know what he's thinking. Put a pin in all this because we'll get to meet Shannon and Kanon in the next part, and that's where I can get into it more. For the moment, I just thought it was worth pegging this line that clearly references the fact that Kanon was supposed to be here and opted not to come. This kind of conscientiousness is just like Aunt Rosa. She's the kind of person who won't forget or break a promise. Now, knowing Rosa and Maria's interactions from later, episode 4 is going to be a rough one, You might think that that's a contradiction, but I actually don't think it entirely is. Both because one key thing in this game is to understand the ways in which people are contradictory. Rosa could be a nice person who's conscientiously remembered to give this gift to a servant who theoretically should be below her attention, below her notice. She shouldn't feel compelled to remember this. The same way she maybe should be compelled to remember giving Natsuhi a gift, which also happens later. And yet at the same time, Rose is forgetting promises to Maria. But that's because there's a difference in how Rose is engaging in these promises. If she said to Kumasawa that she will get her a gift of something, that's a kind of distinctly meaningful choice that she has made and has opted to do. A lot of her promises to Maria are appeasement, trying to get Maria to calm down, guilty things she's only saying because she has fucked up in some way and has upset Maria deeply, or promises she has intentionally opted to break because she doesn't care that much about them. You can being conscientious does not imply that you are always applying your best effort in all situations. Being conscientious means that you have the capacity to do so. You have the kind of care and attention to detail that means you can remember to give someone a present from a year ago. But if you're not going that far, you're not going to do that all the time. And especially with Maria and their strained relationship, she is very exhausted by Maria and is kind of washing her hands of her somewhat. And also a brief shout out to Jessica's bio and the very vague foreshadowing of it is thought she will inherit the headship. It's very vague, but of course she does not inherit the headship, and in fact goes to someone entirely different. It is honestly a very, very small bombshell to me that Kumasawa has quit her job several times. I'm noting that down because I don't know if that's relevant. I don't know if that's going to come up at any point, which is why it feels like such a strange, out of nowhere reveal, even though it's not actually meant to be a reveal. It is especially odd because she knows about Kinzo's grandchild, so she is in an inner circle in a sense. So she is clearly loyal. And yet, not loyal enough to have the Shiramiya symbol on her outfit. Yeah. I don't know a lot about her character background. So that's... I am literally taking some notes. As I've said before, I'm trying to see if the timeline is something I could piece together a little bit too, but I'm also going to put down some questions. One of which is Kumasawa quitting? Question mark? The brief moment where awkwardly Battler's two-house situation is talked around is kind of emblematic of the fact that Battler is not really discussed how he feels about his dad. He has literally been estranged from his family for 6 years, and no one talks about it. People will constantly refer to the fact that they haven't seen him in a long time, but not why. No one's checking in with Battler to ask how he feels. Does he still have animosity towards his dad? Which it seems he does, because a lot of their joking has to be taken as a implied actual hostility, but can only be expressed through teasing that is low key and can be kind of easily hand waved as not serious. And they can't even address it enough just to explain to Maria that, oh, Battler moved and had to move back, because Maria will probably ask why, because Maria will ask those questions, because it is impolite to ask, but Maria has no such notions. So with this part where the shrine has disappeared, how much does Maria know? Because we know from later in the game that shrine is gone because Beatrice blows it up. She is testing a small amount of explosive to see if it works. And it clearly does. Is there any chance that Maria knows that the shrine being gone is connected to Beatrice? Because we know there's also the magical explanation for what happens of bringing the mirror to the shrine and destroying it to free Beatrice's power. Does Maria know that? I don't remember if this is something that at all gets referenced or addressed to Maria. But if Maria did know, Maria would probably be insisting that a good thing was going to happen because she loves Beatrice, and Beatrice having magic power is only good things. Looking at the lines closely, I do think it's about how Maria socializes and takes in information she's told, more than it's about Maria having secret Beatrice knowledge. We know she has a long-term relationship with Beatrice, so we'll pay attention to that, especially if there is any reference to the shrine or Beatrice's power returning and why that's happening. But I think this is just a case of Maria's neurodivergent behavior getting read as slightly eerie. But if you just look at it from Maria's point of view, she was just told, "Oh, misfortune will happen," and Maria's just processing this, starts repeating misfortune, and then when asked, like, "What kind of misfortune, Maria? What could you mean?" But people are just making conversation. She just points to the sky because she knows that a storm is coming, because they all know a storm is coming. That's not hidden knowledge to anyone. But she was trying to say something that no one's understanding or getting communicated to. Again, this frustration definitely comes from Maria's neurodivergence and how she's trying to socialize, and the fact that as much as she understands what she is trying to get across, other people don't take in the information correctly, in the same way that she struggles sometimes to understand other people. I'm gonna put a pin in this, so again, on my list of questions, does Maria know about some impending misfortune / what happened with the shrine? Maria eventually being calmed down by the notion that if the kids are all together, there's nothing to be afraid of. It's a little bit heartbreaking knowing that almost nobody's going to survive this incident, but it's also a somewhat true expression of the kind of solidarity their parents lack or have lost. It's hard to say which. Their parents are very divided and do not draw strength from each other and uplift each other. The cousins, the kids, they do. They're quite tightly knit group. They take care of each other as best they can. Battler works very hard to try and believe in his cousins and refuse to accept any of them as a culprit who could do terrible murders. Meanwhile, the parents immediately fall apart when a pile of gold that they don't even need is right in front of them. It's also a very funny thing that will later get a callback. What George says is always true. That's literally one of the rules from Berncastell's game from the very end of the game. Which also subverts this in a funny way because all the cousins stick together, but Battler is one of the culprits there, so not wise in that case. That brings us to the end of part 2. And now, moving on to part 3, my third video, because not a ton worth spinning out in part 2, but some of it is going to go into some of the stuff that happens in part 3. We get a lot more development on the servants, for instance. This is the part where we meet all 3 of them, Goda as well as Shannon and Cannon, or all 3 of the other servants that have not come up to this point. Goda is kind of a funny character because he's not really that important in the grand scheme of things, but I had a few realizations about him when playing through this section. There's a few things about presentation to do with Goda, because for instance, he's a huge guy. Battler sees him as this huge imposing silhouette that, if it wasn't that he's a servant, would be like, it could be like a bruiser, it could be like a bodyguard or something. We know that Lady's Goda is going to be an absolute coward. He is terrified every time violence comes up. He is actually one of the least capable of handling any time violence gets invoked. Which is funny just because it obviously imbues a kind of contradiction in that, similar to some of the gender role discussion from earlier, there is an assumption that he's this big, tough guy, but he's a chef, he's a fancy man, he's a servant. He wants to show off his great skills at presentation. He happens to have the frame of someone who's large and seems like they could take you in a fight. And I think in some ways that's almost even a tiny red herring, that you could construct a theory that he is the killer. I don't think that's ever realistically on the table. He gets lumped into being suspected as one of the servants at times, but he's not. He's never singled out as a culprit. And of course, he is cultivating this persona very actively. His character bio says he is very highly regarded as a servant. And we know that he will manipulate situations so that he can do glamorous jobs and come off well and present himself very nicely to the family. But if he's faffed about with the tea and that's delayed it, he'll then shove the job onto someone else, realizing that the job will just make him look bad if he actually does it. And so his high regard has to come from him having made the very intentional choice to display his best self and hide any of his fuck-ups and mask them with a different servant to take that blame. And there's even the very first time Battler addresses him, he says, Battler, who doesn't know Goda, says, I don't recognize his face at all, but by his costume I can tell he's a servant, because he is dressed for the part. Later on, Beatrice, I don't know, I'm going to be very curious to see if they ever suspect that one of the servants dresses as Beatrice. They surely must, but I mean, they obviously don't figure that out, they don't realize what the case is. But Beatrice has a certain kind of power by dressing in her elegant outfit, because then you would not conceive that that's the servant, because that's such a high class dress to put on, that none of them are aware of it being in the mansion, so none of them has any clue where it would come from. So it must belong to this woman, whoever Beatrice is. Yeah. I am surprised there is this much to say about Goda, because he feels like a very minor element as the story goes on. I like the moment where Battler says the line. He's explicitly calling out, oh, when the seagulls cry, and we will be returning to that later. I don't know the thematic relevance really. I'm not sure if it's going to be developed more. When I played it the first time, it felt like it was just the kind of branding was why they used this, because I was aware that it was a pre-existing series. It obviously connects in some ways, in the sense that Battler not hearing the seagulls feels like this is not truly the island, which obviously is again about it's been 6 years. Could the seagulls have just left? The answer seems to be no. The answer seems to be it's a storm is why they're not there, because everyone else seems to think the seagulls should be there too. It's not that Battler's been away that long, though it is proposed. But that just by missing that signifier, Battler does recognize the island as the island, but it feels wrong. It feels off. The identity has changed, and not just in a Battler going, oh, are there not seagulls anymore, but Battler thinking, this is not the correct memory. This does not feel the same as the last time I did this, and in a way that makes it feel wrong and not just changed. And to the point that the cries of the seagulls themselves can function as giving him the same feeling as going to a family conference, which is a thing. It's even more potent with smells, but you will have that kind of sense memory that connects one situation and vibe to another. It also leads in pretty neatly to a funny kind of bit of a runner in this section where Battler is oblivious to just how much what he says affects people. It's specifically Maria highlighted in this section, where Maria will copy Battler, believe what he says, and not just believe it, but buy into it in a significant way. There's a later pretty gross part where he talks about Maria making a promise to let him touch her chest when he's older, and it's not good. But Battler is making a promise as a false promise. It is a joke, it is posturing, it is all just his persona that he is projecting. Maria doesn't know that. In this case in particular, Maria is too much of a child to recognize that. One would assume that when she's older, Maria would understand that this was not meant to be a promise to be kept. But Battler's assumption about that is because he's assuming that there will not be repercussions or consequences for his actions. When in the rose garden, he leans over to sniff the flowers and he's just goofing and joking around. And Jessica says, like, don't do that, Maria will get herself caught on thorns. And Battler's like, no, there couldn't be consequences for my actions, as Maria is literally copying him. She thankfully doesn't get caught on thorns or injured in any way, but that's not because Battler was being careful or stopped her, it's just she didn't happen to get hurt. Unfortunately, there is a servant girl who did get hurt because Battler made a promise of love that to him was just speaking romantically to kind of play up feelings and to be a kind of dramatic boy the way he just liked to do back then. And she took it very seriously, despite no further follow-up from him, because he never contradicted what she said, and so she was waiting for him a long time. That leads neatly to another topic, which is about Canon and Shannon from this chapter. Which is about Canon and Shannon from this section. So, we'll come back to some stuff about the Rose Garden after the fact. But first, I do want to hop to the introduction of Canon, followed soon after by Shannon, but not seen through Battler's point of view. Oh, these kids. I obviously introduced it earlier when referring to his absence, but this is his first time seeing Battler. This is kind of a moment that has presumably been set up to create some distance, because Shannon remembers a promise that Battler does not, but she doesn't know that he doesn't remember it yet. She has no clue if he's about to come and suddenly declare his love again, suddenly say that he's so sorry that it's been 6 years. She is prepared to understand his reasons for that because of his complicated family situation. But he has nothing like that in his head. And she is uncertain about how he's going to be. I forget the specifics of the story that's, I believe, from episode 7, so a long ways away. But she has significant doubts. She does wonder, surely he could have contacted me in all these 6 years. Surely would not be very difficult, and it would not have been. So she doesn't want to meet him first. Instead, Canon gets sent out. There is a point later where he will watch what happens to Shannon, where he will be an observer in the situation. And I'll dig into the line when we get to the next spoiler episode, but I'm pretty sure he's implying that his job is to be an observer, to be more of a silent, watchful person. I'm going to dig more into what that means at the time, but at least in this particular scene, it makes sense to say that Canon is mostly there to, from a distance, size up Battler and try to see who he is now. It's been 6 years. What kind of person is he? How is he developed? What does his attitude seem to be? Does he seem to be looking for Shannon? There is a fixation on his age, which is an interesting element given that we know his body is obviously the same age as Shannon's, but he himself projects a younger age, presents a younger age. Without being too specific, he's uncomfortable when asked about his exact age, which is pretty understandable when he is nebulously younger than Shannon, but without any specific date of birth being offered, because also as a servant, they're probably not asking for that very closely. But they will often refer to his age and use his age to justify things, like saying, oh, his frame is very slight. He's not very strong. This is all because he's like a mid-teen boy. He's not like grown into a man, and that's the reason. It is very cute how much Jessica tries to cover for him because she is very anxious for everyone to think her boyfriend is cool. We're gonna get to see way more of that with their date, and I'm looking forward to that bit. And of course, Canon here says he cannot give them more as a greeting because they are furniture. He refers to we because he's referring to himself and to Shannon. Canon in particular is much stronger about this idea than even Shannon. Does not consider them full people. considers himself somewhat subhuman or demi-human, and this is mixed up in the idea of being a servant. And I do think this is partly rooted in the idea of feeling as though because Canon is presenting himself as a persona, that he doesn't count as a person. That they're not equally all valid people. The love game in episode 6, where they're basically deciding who gets to be the person, is about basically asserting that only one of them can self-actualize. Only one of them can be the person who takes over the body full time. And we're going to have a lot to talk about there when we see the actual lines and can really dig through it. But it's so early that they start flagging the idea that I was really fixated on the line that they are furniture and trying to really dig into what that meant beyond the idea of we're not full people, beyond the idea that we are subservient servants. Also, when Canon spills all the stuff, for one, it's incredibly awkward, but for two, I think Canon is surprised that Battler is helping. Battler has been incredibly thoughtless, has done an awful thing to a person that has actually completely undermined their ability to have a life, because their life suddenly revolved around him for years in a way that was unhealthy, and he is not rectified and doesn't even do her the honor of remembering. But what Battler is the kind of kind person who will help out someone who in front of him needs a hand. That's still a fairly, that's thoughtless in the sense that it is not hard to look at that situation and go, oh, I should help, and he just does it, in a way that not everyone would. Clearly, Goda is more of a shit about the situation, but it is undeniable that Battler is doing a nice thing that he's not expected to, and in some ways is expected to specifically not do, because society would consider it beneath him to do this, because that's why they have servants in the first place. But he still just does, and he'll make jokes to brush off the reasons why he shouldn't be helping, and why it's a problem that Canon has required him to do this. He does work to even try to emotionally smooth over the situation, because you could help materially by picking up the stuff that Canon has dropped and putting it in the wheelbarrow, and ultimately only make things worse if, for instance, he got dirt all over his clothes and that caused problems for them having lunch. Then that just reflects badly on Canon, because Battler would not be blamed. They would give that shit to the servant. But Battler does make quite a conscientious effort to make Canon feel okay about things, try to improve the situation, fix it, load the wheelbarrow back up, and then just smooth things over, and at the same time try to warm up to Canon so that he doesn't feel so stiff and uncomfortable about what's happening. I particularly like his line that says, I hate guys who make the waitress pick up the fork they dropped at a restaurant. Battler himself did not spill the wheelbarrow technically, especially as far as Battler is concerned. This was Canon's mistake. But Battler is talking around it to imply that it is not Canon's fault. And in a certain sense, it is Battler's fault, because the shock of seeing Battler is part of what's making Canon so awkward in this situation. This mini solo scene of Canon watching over a hedge as they all left, and looking at how Battler helped him, it's so much that you read this and you don't really know. You just think this is a poor servant who didn't expect guests to help him. But there's so much more baggage going on here than you could have guessed. Oh, well, we will return to the servants, but let me roll back, because the Rose Garden is an interesting place, because later we know that visually it will be the basis for at least some interpretations of the Golden Land. And I could not tell you what the metaphor of the Golden Land is meant to be. I only have a guess about self-actualization, because that just ties into Beatrice in general, but I don't have a working theory, so I'm going to have to form one as we go. With that in mind, it seems like the Rose Garden is important, and we should probably pay attention to what people say about it. One thing in particular is that it's kind of bloomed. Everyone says it's undeniably grown more roses, but Eva kind of laments liking a different style that, even if it had less roses, was her preference. And a funny character note about Eva here that we'll do a mini tangent on is that Ava says this, and Hideyoshi's like, come on, Ava, stop being so rude. Stop, like, shit-talking every single second. And Ava's actually, like, a little offended. She's like, I just meant that sincerely. I actually just wished you could have seen the garden I liked. It's such a funny moment of vulnerability because Ava can't quite turn it off. This is just how she talks. Like, I know people like this in real life who sound really harsh sometimes, even when they're genuinely just trying to say a nice thing. Like, if you boil down what Ava's saying to, like, something in a different wording, she is saying, oh, I loved the garden of when I was a child. I wish you could see it. That's just a really nice thought. That's just like, oh, she's nostalgic for her own view of this garden. And it's not supposed to score points against Cries for having fucked up their garden. But you can certainly understand why people would think that's what she's saying. And it ties in later, too, to a part where she does intentionally needle Goda a little bit. Because Goda has just let Kanon flail. Kanon makes a mistake, and then Goda lets him flail while basically kind of criticizing him. Kanon's a child, bear in mind. He should really not be working a full-time job. And Ava kind of highlights this. Ava's like, you could have helped him. Shouldn't you have done something like that? And Goda kind of has to awkwardly accept, like, yes, milady, since she has said it and not Kanon, he does have to accept that that's true and try to save face a little bit. That's a case where Ava is being rude and needling, but it is a good thing because Goda does this to Shannon and Kanon, and he gets away with it normally. But Ava's the kind of person who will speak out and be like, that's a little fucked up, don't you think? And that is useful. Just because she's being rude does not mean she's being a bad person. And that's a case where I would think she did a good thing there that no one else would have. Like, the good-natured Hideyoshi would not directly challenge Goda about that. And a lot of the kids probably wouldn't either, because they would just think that's rude in and of itself. They would just try to support Kanon like they did. I think we will talk more about Maria and her rose later, because it gets introduced here, but there's a lot more time to come down the line. The one thing I'll point out here is that George says that the rose should be given a name. For something to really be treasured and stand out and be remembered, it needs a name. Because there are so many roses that you need them to be distinct. One way to do that is to give it clothing, like wrapping a little sweet wrapper around it. Another way is to give it a name. One way is that Maria notices it in the first place because it stands out as different, because it is not grown as much. And there's an obvious parallel, of course, because Maria is a person who has not developed in the way that is expected of her. And she is aware of this. She is obviously aware of this because of the amount of time she is being criticized, insists she must behave in certain ways she doesn't quite grasp and struggles with. She is painfully aware of her situation. There's a very good line later where, talking about Kanon, people say that he's a little bit antisocial. And Maria's like, oh, people say that about me too. And Shannon, trying to comfort her, is like, oh, that's not true, Maria, you're not like that. But Maria's upset by Shannon's attempt to comfort her, because Maria wants to identify with Kanon. Because I think Maria likes Kanon, sees something of herself in him, and the idea that she's told that that's not true is a little bit upsetting because it's preventing her from identifying in that way. The same way she wants to identify with this rose. So much is going to happen with this rose. Oh no. We'll get there. Brief notes about Kinzo here. A lot of Battler's understanding of Kinzo are kind of based on hearsay from his dad. And one thing that I think about this depiction of the head of the family was a violent man who rained blows on his sons with his own fists and even beat his daughters mercilessly with a wooden sword. We're fairly confident in the idea that Kinzo is an abusive father. That's not hard to square. But I can't help think this is a portrayal that is very much shaped by the messenger. This feels like the kind of abusive violent man that Battler's dad would describe, because that is the kind of thing he would focus on. There's a different kind of abuse that happens to Ava because she is a woman, and he treats her in sexist ways, and he undermines her abilities and potential because she is a woman and not a man. And that's the kind of thing she would think about. Meanwhile, Rudolph thinks in the violence, thinks in forceful nature, and thinks in, punishment. And in the way, this is the kind of thing he could deploy to his child, to say, hey, I yank on your ear to stop you being a brat. But my dad would fucking hit me. So you should count yourself lucky and just listen to what I tell you. And also, I will note here, I don't think Jessica knows Kinzo is dead. I don't think she's in on the act, which is interesting. I might be wrong, but these lines of dialogue do not read as lying to me. It reads as she is being tricked and also not paying much attention because she wouldn't imagine her parents would hide the fact that her grandfather died. Natsuhi having headaches is actually a very funny way to come back to the idea of nature versus nurture. Because I've talked before about the Ashuramiya blood, the spiteful Ashuramiya genes, and how those are a little bit made up because there's a lot more circumstance going on there than genetic kind of traits being passed down. Natsuhi's headaches, she was born with this discomfort. Those are nature. And other characters do have things like this too. For instance, Jessica has breathing problems. That's just an illness she has. It was not obtained by circumstance. She just developed it. Anyway, Natsuhi just has headaches. That is not something that comes from her, how she was raised. That is just natural to her. That is her nature. It's very easy to start to think of everything as being learned behavior, but there are differences that make people just actually functionally different. There are parts of people's personality and behavior that come from their physical form, the way that their brain is made up. You can't only attribute things to your environment, because otherwise you would be much more similar to your siblings than otherwise. Because otherwise you'd be much more similar to your siblings than you actually are. Of course, Eva teasing Shannon to get at Natsuhi is back to Eva being a little bit shitty and needling for her own gain and for her own fun, rather than being anyway virtuous. Meanwhile, Rosa tries to help a little bit by just getting Shannon in on the joke of what is being made kind of at her expense. And it is a little bit funny that Hideyoshi just laughs and says, oh, I get that poison every day, I'm used to it. But in a sense, that's also saying that Hideyoshi is best positioned to understand his wife and know, oh, this is a case where she's joking around, this is a case where she's actually trying to needle someone. Of course, he doesn't mean he always picks up on her intention, because earlier he did misread her, but he probably more than anyone else can read the difference between a jab and just a little light playful teasing. Just to first talk about material things. The moment in the corridor, 4 of the servants there, everyone except Goda, so Shannon, Kanon, Genji, and Kumasawa. All the servants who know about Kinzo's grandchild, 2 of them being people who inhabit the body of Kinzo's grandchild, and there's so much happening here. This is the part I was referencing earlier, where when Shannon asks if he was watching, Kanon says that is his role. There is an extent to which later on we will see that the different personas are partly crafted to fulfill different functions. In the same way that, for instance, Maria as a child has a role she is supposed to be fulfilling. There is a way in which Kanon, Shannon, and Beatrice are all crafted to be different roles. They function differently in interactions. I was saying earlier that Beatrice, wearing her fancy dress, would not read as a servant and would read as like a rich person of importance. In the same way, Kanon being a quiet, shy teen boy, for the most part, most people are probably going to disengage with him and be like, well, he doesn't talk much. It's kind of uncomfortable, it's kind of unfortunate. But I'm certainly not going to make that effort. Badler is somewhat unusual in that he does. Jessica also takes to him and likes him. But I can't imagine Natsuhi tries to get much out of him, aside from saying that he should talk and be polite. So his role as one who observes is an interesting idea. I don't know if later he will come from any specific idea of needing to observe things. I don't know if there's going to be maybe a situation or a circumstance that requires he be a more detached observer than Shannon, who is doing her best to try and be a meek servant, and also is observed. As a woman, she is one who will be looked at. The dialogue is very finely written, that there's not really a clue per se that Shannon and Cannon are the same person. But if you watch this scene and how Shannon and Cannon talk, and then Genji appears, talks to Shannon, does not directly address Cannon, you can imagine that in this moment, Shannon is there, she is dressed as Shannon. Cannon is not dressed in that moment. Cannon and Shannon were talking kind of internally in their head. Genji does not see Cannon, addresses Shannon, then Cannon addresses Genji, so Cannon says something. At which point Genji, with a pause, seamlessly accepts that he is there. Genji is accepting of the multiple personhoods involved, swiftly addresses that in the conversation, and makes no deal of it. This is why you won't notice anything unusual. If you just read this, you'll just think of it as he talked to one servant and then the other addressed him. But when you understand what is physically in this scene, you can kind of see a bit clearer how it's functioning. Meanwhile, Kumasawa looks on, underscores the tragedy of them, underscores how much more tragic it is when you understand their situation better, and even manages to give a reference to the fact that you think that Kinzo's trifling whims made an inferiority complex for Natsuhi. You think that's, oh no, she doesn't like that he picked servants. No, it's that he gave her a baby and said, you can't make a baby, have this one. And she was like, what? And she has never recovered from that. Even after they have produced a child, the child was not a suitable enough heir, and continues to have this inferiority complex. And it's not going away because other people are making use of that inferiority complex to needle Natsuhi, to try to undermine her, to try and improve their own positions. And this is another form of abuse. Kenzo has managed to give an inferiority complex to Natsuhi because she was so devastated by such a callous thing where he would refuse to communicate, hand her a baby, and then also not address when she loses the baby. We're gonna talk about this. We're going to have to dig into this in more depth. But just this throwaway line, I feel so bad for Natsuhi. I did early on in the game too, but it got so much worse. But with that, we're going to have to cut it here. I had so much to say about the servants. I combined this with the part 2 episode because I had very little to say about part 2 in isolation, but some of it really did feed into this later stuff. That's all for this episode. Thank you for watching.